The rise and fall of America's most dangerous gangs. Bloodlines and beginnings. In the shadows of American cities, loyalty can be deadlier than hate. From Los Angeles to Chicago, from prison yards to quiet suburbs, these gangs weren't just criminals, they were nations within a nation, built on blood, betrayal, and survival. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All information is drawn from publicly available sources, including FBI and DEA reports, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Statistics, Interpol and Europol bulletins, and major news investigations from the New York Times, BBC, The Guardian, and El País. The story of America's most dangerous gangs didn't begin with Hollywood's obsession or tabloid headlines. It began in forgotten neighborhoods, where poverty, racism, and neglect met ambition and anger. To understand how these groups became some of the most feared organizations in the Western world, you have to start where all power begins, the streets. The birth of Brotherhoods. According to FBI historical archives and sociological studies, the first organized street gangs in America emerged in the late 1800s, mostly among immigrant groups in New York, Boston, and Chicago. Irish, Italian, and Jewish youth formed neighborhood crews to protect themselves from rival ethnic enclaves and corrupt police forces. But by the 1970s and 80s, the problem had evolved into something else entirely. The south-central neighborhoods of Los Angeles became the cradle of a new kind of brotherhood, one born out of segregation and systemic exclusion. In the 1960s, many black youth organizations were community-focused, inspired by civil rights leaders and neighborhood defense groups. But after the fall of major civil rights movements and the infiltration of narcotics, these same communities fractured. That's when two names changed everything, the Crips and the Bloods. Blue and Red. Court filings and declassified LAPD gang unit reports trace the early Crips back to Raymond Washington and Stanley "Tookie" Williams, both of whom envisioned a group that could unite and protect African American youth against police brutality and rival threats. But within a few short years, internal divisions and access to illegal firearms turned the alliance violent. What began as protection quickly mutated into domination. By the mid-1970s, the Crips were so dominant that other neighborhoods banded together for survival. Those alliances, initially loose coalitions of smaller sets, evolved into what became known as the Bloods. The color red became their armor, blue their enemy's banner, and the streets their battlefield. According to a 1988 Los Angeles Times investigation, there were more than 300 active sets across the county, with violent incidents reported almost daily. The cycle was relentless. Retaliation followed retaliation, and prisons became recruiting grounds. Inside the prison gates. While Los Angeles bled, another force was rising inside the California Department of Corrections. Behind concrete walls, racial divisions hardened. According to state prison intelligence memos and later congressional hearings, inmate groups began to form along ethnic lines for protection against assaults and discrimination. For Hispanic inmates, the result was the Mexican Mafia, or La IM. Founded in the late 1950s at Dual Vocational Institution, this organization wasn't just about protection, it was about control. Members established a strict code, collecting taxes from street gangs and ordering hits on those who defied them. Within decades, their influence extended far beyond the cell block. Police reports and federal indictments later confirmed that La IM could issue commands from inside solitary confinement that rippled across the entire state. In response, African American inmates formed their own defense networks, most notably the Black Guerrilla Family, modeled after revolutionary ideals but often corrupted by violence and internal power struggles. White inmates, feeling outnumbered, consolidated under the Aryan Brotherhood, a group born in San Quentin that blended prison politics with racial ideology. By the 1980s, the U.S. prison system had become a war zone of alliances and vendettas, each gang mirroring the street conflicts outside. The Cocaine Wars. When crack cocaine flooded urban America in the mid-1980s, everything changed. Federal investigations and the 1989 U.S. Sentencing Commission report confirmed that street gangs became the distributors for larger cartel networks. The profit margins were staggering, and for the first time, gang violence wasn't just about turf, it was about business. Drive-by shootings, open-air drug markets, and police raids defined the era. Entire city blocks in Los Angeles, Detroit, and Miami turned into microeconomies run by teenagers with automatic weapons. According to DEA records, the number of gang-related homicides in Los Angeles County alone doubled between 1984 and 1991. But with money came betrayal. Rival sets within the same gang began killing each other over territory. Informants traded loyalty for leniency. And while communities suffered, the federal government responded with sweeping legislation, the 1994 Crime Bill, which expanded sentencing and prison construction nationwide. Critics argue that while it targeted gang leaders, it also devastated minority communities, incarcerating thousands for nonviolent offenses. The Northern Expansion. As law enforcement cracked down on West Coast operations, many members were transferred to federal prisons across the country. Unintentionally, this spread gang culture nationwide. According to a 2006 Justice Department report, by the early 2000s there were active Bloods and Crips sets in more than 40 states, from New York to Texas. Meanwhile, Hispanic organizations such as the Nuestra Familia, MS-13, and 18th Street Gang grew in power, crossing borders and establishing international networks. The MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, originated among Salvadoran refugees in Los Angeles during the 1980s Civil War. Facing discrimination, they formed their own gang for survival. But when members were deported en masse in the 1990s, they exported their violence back to Central America, creating a transnational criminal enterprise. According to Homeland Security assessments, MS-13 operated in both hemispheres by 2005, becoming a symbol of organized street terror across the Americas. Undercover and underground. By the turn of the century, law enforcement agencies had learned to adapt. Federal task forces like the FBI's Safe Streets initiative combined intelligence sharing across states. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and the RICO Act, originally designed for mafia prosecutions, became the government's most powerful tools against gang leadership. One landmark case, U.S. v. Lopez, 2008, resulted in life sentences for multiple leaders of a Los Angeles-based drug trafficking ring affiliated with the Mexican Mafia. Court filings revealed coded letters, hidden ledgers, and encrypted messages sent from within Supermax prisons. According to prosecutors, the orders were written in tiny script, folded into plastic, and smuggled out in legal mail, a chilling example of how deep the organization's reach had become. But even as arrests increased, experts warned of a dangerous pattern. When leaders were removed, younger, more volatile successors took their place. Sociologist Malcolm Klein famously called it the Hydra effect: cut off one head, and two grow back. The digital era of gangs. In the 2010s, something unprecedented happened. Gang warfare went online. Instagram, Facebook, and later TikTok became digital battlegrounds for clout and intimidation. According to a 2020 Chicago Police Department cybercrime report, over 60% of local gang conflicts originated from online insults, posts, comments, or live streams. Rappers affiliated with sets used their music to broadcast affiliations, sometimes leading to deadly real-world consequences. Investigators began using digital footprints, GPS tags, photos, and comments to connect crimes to suspects. The street code of silence began to erode in a world where everyone was documenting themselves. And yet, for many young people, these gangs still represented belonging in a society that seemed to offer none. The culture, the colors, the names, they carried legacy and fear in equal measure. The collapse within. By the mid-2010s, federal pressure, social media exposure, and community outreach started showing results. According to the FBI's 2019 National Gang Threat Assessment, overall gang-related homicides in major cities declined compared to the 1990s. Programs focusing on rehabilitation, education, and job placement began reducing youth recruitment. But decline didn't mean disappearance. Inside prisons, alliances persisted. Outside, offshoots rebranded themselves as crews or cliques, shifting from open violence to cyber fraud, identity theft, and drug smuggling through encrypted apps. One unconfirmed intelligence memo obtained by ProPublica suggested that some organizations were investing in legitimate businesses, auto shops, trucking companies, and even cryptocurrency schemes, to launder money. The streets had evolved, the empire adapted. Legacy of violence. For every statistic, there's a story. A mother lighting candles for her son lost in a drive-by. A father still waiting on parole after following orders from a leader he never met. A detective who spent decades chasing ghosts, knowing that justice rarely balances the scales. The rise and fall of America's gangs isn't just about crime. It's about power, poverty, and the choices people make when they feel they have none. It's about how a system built to punish often forgets to heal. As one retired LAPD gang detective told The Guardian, "You can arrest 100 men, but you can't arrest an idea." And that idea, of loyalty, identity, and survival, still lingers in the alleys, prisons, and music of America. Power, profit, and betrayal. Power. It's the drug no one ever quits. After years of bloodshed and survival, America's most dangerous gangs discovered a truth older than the streets themselves: power isn't earned by fear alone. It's sustained by profit. And profit, as history shows, changes everything. The shift from turf to empire. In the early 1990s, a new generation of gang leaders looked beyond street corners. According to federal indictments and Justice Department task force findings, they began coordinating across states, merging street power with business acumen. The cocaine wars of the 1980s had proven one thing: drugs could buy influence faster than bullets. Former gang members, now cooperating witnesses, later told prosecutors that entire neighborhoods functioned like corporations. One crew handled supply, another distribution, another collected street taxes. Even violence had a price, ordered only when it protected revenue. In Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, undercover FBI operations revealed that local sets were no longer acting independently. They answered to regional councils, each reporting to incarcerated figureheads who communicated through coded messages, contraband phones, or lawyers carrying legal documents stuffed with hidden instructions. This was the birth of the gang as enterprise model, a silent shift that turned street chaos into organized hierarchy. Money laundering and the cleanup game. Court filings from United States v. Lopez, 2008, and U.S. v. Barajas, 2011, exposed an evolution that many had missed: gangs were learning finance. As cash poured in from narcotics, extortion, and stolen goods, leaders faced a problem: how to make dirty money clean. So they learned to launder. According to Treasury Department case studies, millions were funneled through used car dealerships, auto body shops, and music labels. Others used nightclubs, barber shops, or even church donations as fronts. Street soldiers who once carried guns were now moving product through supply chains, logistics companies, and offshore accounts. Some organizations used prepaid debit cards and wire transfers, exploiting the gaps in anti-money laundering systems. A 2013 FBI report detailed how a blood subset in Atlanta used multiple small businesses to disguise over $8 million in drug profits within 2 years, a stunning example of how street tactics had turned corporate. Behind every successful scheme was a lawyer, an accountant, or a banker who asked too few questions. And behind every betrayal was someone who wanted a larger cut. The cartel connection. By the early 2000s, the walls between American street gangs and Latin American cartels had begun to crumble. According to DEA intelligence summaries, Mexican cartels such as Sinaloa, CJNG, and Gulf realized they could outsource distribution to U.S. gangs that already controlled urban territories. It was a perfect partnership. The cartels supplied high-purity narcotics at wholesale prices, the gangs provided manpower and protection. In 2005, Operation Accelerator exposed a nationwide pipeline between cartel distributors and U.S. street networks, involving more than 700 arrests across 19 states. Investigators found detailed ledgers that read less like gang graffiti and more like accounting books: weights, prices, profit margins. But partnerships built on greed rarely last. Disputes over shipments led to assassinations. Informants vanished. And when one side felt cheated, violence erupted on both sides of the border. According to a 2009 Justice Department brief, dozens of gang-related murders in California, Arizona, and Texas were linked directly to broken cartel deals, proof that loyalty ended where profit began. Inside the walls, power consolidated. While the streets chased money, the prisons refined order. Inside facilities like Pelican Bay, Florence ADX, and Marion, power structures crystallized into councils, committees, or tables, as they were known in coded letters later seized by federal agents. Each faction had representatives responsible for collecting dues, enforcing discipline, and approving hits. Contrary to popular belief, most gang wars inside weren't about color or ideology. They were about economics, control over contraband, visitation privileges, and commissary smuggling rings. Prison investigators testified in U.S. v. Cervantes, 2013. That one letter from a Mexican Mafia lieutenant could halt all violence in a yard, or start a riot by morning. Behind those concrete walls, power was pure. No cameras, no news crews, no glory, just influence measured by obedience. And it was there that the next evolution began, expanding beyond crime entirely. Politics in the shadows. It might sound unbelievable, but according to Los Angeles Times investigations and state court disclosures, gang influence quietly touched city politics in several municipalities. Community figures with legitimate nonprofit fronts received donations traced back to street leaders seeking leniency or legitimacy. In one unconfirmed but widely reported instance, a local council candidate was photographed attending a charity event sponsored by an organization later indicted for racketeering. The goal wasn't ideology, it was leverage. If they couldn't buy freedom, they'd buy favor. Some leaders began funding community outreach programs, scholarships, and food drives, blurring the line between reformation and reputation management. For younger members, these acts created confusion. Were they still soldiers, or were they citizens trying to redeem the name that raised them? The truth was both. Power had always been the real product, crime was merely its currency. The fallouts of betrayal. Power breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds betrayal. Within the tightly woven networks, federal infiltration became almost routine. Wiretaps, flipped associates, and the omnipresence of social media eroded secrecy. The 2015 arrest of a high-ranking gang coordinator in New York, later chronicled in court transcripts, revealed a web of double crosses. Undercover agents recorded hours of conversations between men who called each other brother, plotting assassinations over profits lost. The indictment noted that the gang's leadership structure had been compromised by its own greed. In Chicago, according to Cook County court records, rival factions within the same umbrella organization began posting online threats, outing members, and doxing rivals, behavior that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. The betrayal wasn't just internal, it was generational. Younger members no longer feared hierarchy. They wanted viral fame, not silent power. Old rules, no snitching, no surrender, were replaced by live-streamed confessions and court testimony. For many original leaders, still locked away, watching from behind glass, it was the ultimate punishment, to see the empire they built unravel in real time. Federal retaliation. The government wasn't passive. After September 11, anti-terror laws expanded investigative authority, and by the 2010s, those powers were applied to criminal networks. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, became the hammer of choice. One case in 2017, United States v. Wilson et al. saw over 80 defendants indicted in a single coordinated sweep across multiple states. Prosecutors linked murders, extortion, and narcotics distribution under one umbrella charge: organized crime conspiracy. Federal agents began treating gang structures like insurgent cells, mapping communications, intercepting money flows, and freezing assets before arrests were even made. According to the FBI's 2021 Gang Threat Assessment, nearly 75% of major street gang takedowns in the decade involved digital forensics, text messages, GPS data, and encrypted apps. Technology that once empowered members to flaunt wealth online had become the evidence sealing their convictions. The crackdown worked, but it also created voids, power vacuums that others rushed to fill. The businessmen of the new era. Out of those voids emerged something new: the entrepreneur gangsters. They wore designer suits instead of colors, ran LLCs instead of corners, but their methods were the same: intimidation, manipulation, control. According to Bloomberg Business Week investigations and IRS forfeiture documents, several mid-level figures transitioned into semi-legitimate ventures: trucking, construction, cryptocurrency trading, even influencer marketing. They spoke the language of business, yet their networks relied on the same code of silence. One criminologist from Rutgers University described it as the corporatization of crime, a phase where violence becomes branding, and notoriety becomes capital. Ironically, as these modern players pursued legitimacy, mainstream culture began romanticizing their predecessors. Documentaries, rap lyrics, and social media nostalgia turned the image of the gangster into a myth, a cultural export consumed by millions who never felt the cost. The hidden victims. For every story of profit, there's a ledger of loss. Victims of extortion who never reported crimes for fear of retaliation. Families displaced by neighborhood wars that made them strangers in their own city. And generations of children raised without fathers because of sentences that outlast lifetimes. Community activists in South Central Los Angeles and Chicago's Englewood still fight to rebuild trust between residents and police, a challenge made harder by decades of trauma and mistrust. Many of these neighborhoods remain economic deserts, proof that when the streets collapse, the scars remain. According to a 2022 Urban Institute report, even with gang violence declining, the socioeconomic impact persists. Property values, education quality, and employment opportunities lag behind national averages. The fall of the gang empires may have ended the gunfire, but not the silence that followed. Reflections of a Former Soldier. In a 2021 documentary interview for PBS's Frontline, a former gang enforcer, identified only as Luis R., described the turning point. At first, we thought we were building something. Then you realize you're just feeding it, this machine that eats everyone. It eats your friends, your kids, even you. His words echoed a truth that statistics could never capture. The rise and fall of America's most dangerous gangs wasn't just a criminal saga, it was a generational tragedy, a system perpetuated by desperation and sustained by illusion. The inevitable downfall. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, gang structures once feared as invincible began to fracture under their own weight. Internal distrust, relentless prosecutions, and shifting cultural values stripped them of the aura that once defined them. Today, some of those original names still survive, relics of a past era, whispered more for nostalgia than fear. But the streets remember. Every corner has ghosts, of ambition, betrayal, and broken oaths. The empire that once thrived on violence learned the hardest truth of all: power borrowed through blood never lasts. Because eventually, every kingpin faces the same reckoning, not death, not prison, but irrelevance. The global web, how American gangs spread worldwide. In the beginning, it was local. A few blocks, a few colors, a code of loyalty. But once the gates of deportation, digital communication, and globalization opened, the streets of Los Angeles and Chicago echoed across oceans. What started as neighborhood warfare became a global network, a shadow economy that crossed borders faster than any passport ever could. The export of violence. In the 1990s, the U.S. government began large-scale deportations of convicted gang members to their home countries, hoping to reduce domestic crime. Instead, they exported the problem. According to Department of Homeland Security data, thousands of individuals tied to the 18th Street Gang and MS-13 were sent back to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Most arrived to nations already weakened by civil war, poverty, and fragile institutions. Without rehabilitation or reintegration programs, these men brought American-style gang structures, hierarchies, hand signs, initiation rituals, to societies ill-prepared to handle them. By the early 2000s, Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18 weren't just street gangs, they were transnational forces controlling neighborhoods, ports, and even parts of government police units. According to UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimates, they were responsible for tens of thousands of killings across Central America. The irony was brutal: what began as protection for immigrants in Los Angeles had evolved into the region's most feared criminal syndicate. Crossing the Atlantic. As Latin American networks grew, Europe took notice. Spanish and Italian law enforcement began tracing drug shipments and money flows linked to American-born gangs operating alongside local mafias. Interpol bulletins from 2010 to 2016 documented the presence of U.S.-style sets in Madrid, Milan, and London, often small groups using the branding and reputation of their American counterparts to command respect on the streets. One British criminology report titled Gangs Without Borders described how online music, rap culture, and social media romanticized American gangs, creating a cultural export that merged with local youth violence. You could find kids in East London tagging walls with LA symbols they'd never actually seen, proof that reputation had become the new currency of power. But where imitation spread, authentic organization followed. Investigations by Europol in 2020 revealed that American and Caribbean gangs were acting as logistical partners in cocaine distribution across Rotterdam and Antwerp. Containers once controlled by Colombian cartels were now coordinated by hybrid crews. A blend of Latin American traffickers, European fixers, and ex-US gang members fluent in both worlds. Globalization had turned the gang model into a franchise. The cyber expansion. The 2010s brought a new battlefield: cyberspace. According to the FBI's Cyber Division and Europol's 2022 joint report, street gangs began migrating their operations online: identity theft, credit card fraud, cryptocurrency scams, even ransomware. Social media, once a platform for intimidation, became a tool for recruitment and surveillance. Hashtags replaced hand signs. A viral post could start a war faster than a drive-by. Some gangs hired freelance hackers from Eastern Europe or West Africa to manage digital accounts and launder funds through crypto wallets. These networks blurred the line between traditional organized crime and cybercrime. Law enforcement dubbed them G-hybrids, gangsters with laptops instead of pistols. Court documents from United States v. Barrera, 2021, describe an operation where members of a Texas-based crew ran phishing scams generating over $12 million in stolen data profits. The indictment noted that the group still used old-school discipline, threats, initiations, oaths, but their battlefield was the internet. The street had gone digital, and borders meant nothing. Alliances and mercenaries. As profits expanded, so did ambition. Former enemies found themselves doing business together, not for loyalty, but for logistics. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Nuestra Familia all made temporary alliances with cartel factions to protect smuggling routes through Texas, Arizona, and California. Declassified DEA cables and congressional testimonies describe a pragmatic kind of peace, a ceasefire based on shared profit. Enemies at lunch, one agent called it. In South America, street gangs formed ties with guerrilla remnants controlling rural cocaine labs. In West Africa, American-inspired gangs provided security for shipping routes used to move narcotics into Europe. Interpol reports from 2019 identified criminal patterns linking gang activity in Baltimore with operations in Accra and Lagos, a web stitched together by cell phones and crypto wallets. Wherever there was demand, someone from the network filled it. It wasn't about turf anymore. It was about trade. Europe's response. European governments reacted late but decisively. Spain's Operación Halcón, Operation Falcon, in 2018 dismantled a major MS-13 cell in Madrid, seizing weapons, cash, and ritual documents identical to those found in Los Angeles raids 2 decades earlier. British authorities launched the National Crime Agency's Gang Matrix, tracking thousands of individuals connected to US-influenced crews. Critics called it invasive. Supporters said it was survival. Meanwhile, community programs began teaching youth about the myth of American gang glamour. Educators screened documentaries showing the reality, not the Instagram highlight reel. For every aspiring shot caller, there was now a social worker ready with a second option. But the allure persisted. As one London detective told The Guardian, "The stories are seductive. They make poverty feel powerful. That's hard to compete with." The global money trail. In 2023, Europol and the FBI traced nearly €400 million in laundered proceeds linked to US-origin gangs. Funds moved through cryptocurrency mixers, real estate investments in Spain, and luxury car imports in Dubai. Each transaction was a fingerprint of a global ecosystem, from cocaine in California to condos in Barcelona. Financial investigators noticed something remarkable: the hierarchy was flattening. Instead of a single godfather, there were dozens of microbosses running semi-autonomous branches connected only by encrypted messaging apps. It was the decentralization of crime, a blockchain of human greed. Traditional law enforcement struggled to keep pace. Every time they shut down one node, 2 new ones appeared, mirroring the exact pattern that once defined gang evolution on American soil. The myth and the merchandise. As violence became global, so did the culture. Music, fashion, tattoos, and slang, all exported through movies, YouTube, and TikTok. Brands began borrowing aesthetics once feared: bandanas, graffiti fonts, even the word gang itself. Sociologists warned that global youth culture was commodifying trauma. The same symbols that marked oppression in South Central were now printed on European streetwear. An idea born in pain was being sold as style. This commercialization blurred responsibility. When rebellion becomes marketable, who owns the message? The original communities, still scarred by violence, watched their struggle turned into global entertainment. The quiet return. Ironically, as the world imitated the American model, the original architects faded into silence. Many first-generation leaders were serving life sentences or had aged out of relevance. The streets that once defined them were now controlled by algorithms, influencers, and organized cyber cells. But history has a way of repeating. In 2024, federal prosecutors announced new indictments against hybrid networks connecting gangs from Los Angeles, El Salvador, and Spain. The documents described an international brotherhood, coordinating drug and human trafficking routes via encrypted apps, a 21st-century version of the same story told in graffiti and gunfire 50 years earlier. Power had simply changed shape. The machine was still running, it just spoke more languages. The human cost. Behind every statistic lies a border crosser, a mother, a child. Entire families fleeing gang-controlled zones in Central America risked their lives to reach the very country that once deported the gangs back to them. According to UN refugee data, more than 600,000 people were displaced from the Northern Triangle nations in 2022, many citing gang threats as the reason. The cycle had become global. America exports crime, the world imports fear, and the refugees come back seeking safety. A tragic loop, stitched together by decisions made decades ago in forgotten neighborhoods. Echoes of control. Experts now describe modern gang structures as networks of influence rather than territorial groups. Their power isn't in numbers, but in connectivity. A message sent from a prison cell in California can trigger actions in Madrid within hours. That's globalization's dark mirror, instant communication serving ancient instincts. And yet, buried in this chaos, there's evidence of transformation. Community programs in El Salvador, Honduras, and the U.S. are rehabilitating ex-members through education and technology. Former enforcers are learning coding, logistics, digital marketing, skills that once served crime now redirected toward commerce. Redemption, like corruption, travels fast. The new age of reform, breaking the cycle. Every empire eventually faces its reckoning. For decades, American gangs ruled through fear, loyalty, and control. But as time passed, new generations began to question what all the bloodshed had bought them. The same streets that once worshipped gang kings were now raising their children to escape that throne. And from the ashes of violence, a quieter revolution began, one built not on dominance, but on redemption. The turning point. By the 2020s, the numbers spoke for themselves. According to the FBI's 2022 National Gang Report, gang-related homicides in major U.S. cities had dropped by nearly 40% compared to the 1990s peak. But more telling than the statistics was the shift in mentality. A generation raised in chaos had grown tired of funerals. They'd seen too many mothers bury sons, too many friends vanish into concrete walls. The myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by an urgent need for change. And surprisingly, some of that change came from inside the system itself. From inmates to mentors. In prisons like San Quentin, Pelican Bay, and Rikers Island, a new movement took root. Former gang leaders began using their influence not for power, but for prevention. Through programs such as Inside Out Writers, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and Project Change, inmates turned educators, teaching literacy, accountability, and emotional discipline to younger prisoners. Court-approved rehabilitation reports describe how rival members sat across from each other in workshops, men who once would have stabbed on sight, now debating philosophy, fatherhood, and survival. For many, it was the first time they'd ever been listened to as human beings, not suspects. According to interviews published by The Atlantic in 2021, participation in restorative justice programs cut recidivism by more than half. One former gang captain put it bluntly. You can't undo the past, but you can stop it from repeating. That's the only kind of leadership that matters now. The streets reimagined. Outside prison walls, the transformation spread. Cities once ravaged by turf wars became testing grounds for community-led initiatives. Los Angeles launched GRYD, the Gang Reduction and Youth Development Program, pairing at-risk youth with mentors who had lived the life themselves. Chicago expanded Ceasefire and Cure Violence, hiring reformed gang members as violence interrupters, mediators who step into conflicts before they erupt. Their method was simple but radical: empathy over enforcement. Instead of arresting kids, they talked to them. Instead of policing trauma, they treated it. Reports from the University of Chicago Crime Lab show that neighborhoods with active interrupter programs saw homicide rates fall by up to 30% in just 2 years. The data was clear: understanding succeeded where fear had failed. The digital redemption. The same technology that once amplified gang wars became the weapon of reform. Former members took to YouTube, TikTok, and podcasts to tell their stories, unfiltered, unscripted, and real. They used hashtags not to glorify violence, but to expose it. Channels like Glockboy Redemption, Hood Transformations, and From Street to Studio built millions of views sharing stories of change. Young viewers who might have once admired gang life were now hearing its survivors say, "Don't make my mistake." Digital media also gave ex-members a second life. Through online mentorship, remote jobs, and re-entry training, technology bridged the gap that prisons once widened. As one reformed gang member said in a 2023 Vice interview, "The streets used to trap us. Now the internet sets us free, if you use it right." Women on the front line. For too long, the narrative of gangs focused only on men. But women, mothers, sisters, partners, were always part of the story, often as unseen victims or silent survivors. That silence began to break. Grassroots organizations like Mothers of Murdered Sons, Peace Over Pain, and Sisters of the Streets started redefining justice from the ground up. They organized neighborhood peace walks, offered therapy for trauma survivors, and petitioned lawmakers for sentencing reform. A 2022 report from the Marshall Project highlighted how women-led initiatives were responsible for over 40% of successful re-entry programs in California and Illinois. Their impact wasn't measured in arrests or convictions, but in something far rarer, healing. One founder, whose son was killed in a gang crossfire, said during a vigil, "If love can't stop a bullet, maybe it can stop the next one from being fired." The policy shift. After decades of tough-on-crime politics, policymakers began acknowledging what communities had known for years: punishment without prevention doesn't work. Reform movements pushed for restorative justice, mental health access, and education programs as part of sentencing. The First Step Act, 2018, and later state-level reforms created incentives for rehabilitation, allowing thousands of inmates to shorten sentences through education and vocational achievements. Cities began redirecting portions of their police budgets toward prevention, funding after-school programs, job training, and therapy for trauma-affected youth. Critics called it naive. Supporters called it overdue. For the first time, the system that once mass-produced convicts was beginning to manufacture second chances. The global reform wave. The ripple reached beyond America. In El Salvador and Honduras, where gang warfare had claimed tens of thousands of lives, reformation projects gained momentum. International NGOs began sponsoring exit programs, safe houses and job pipelines for ex-members seeking a way out. One program, Homies Unidos, originally founded in Los Angeles, now operates across Central America. Its counselors, many of them deported former gang members, help youth transition from crime to community leadership. According to United Nations Development Program data, neighborhoods with active reintegration centers saw a 25% drop in violent crime over 5 years. In Europe, cities like Madrid, London, and Paris adopted similar models, pairing local police with social workers and ex-members to mediate disputes. The world had finally learned, you can't police despair, you have to replace it. The power of story. The transformation of America's gang landscape didn't come from one leader or one policy, it came from storytelling. When the people who once glorified destruction began speaking about regret, the myth lost its shine. Documentaries, podcasts, and even Netflix series began focusing on redemption arcs instead of bloodshed. One such project, Concrete to Conscious, followed 3 former gang leaders rebuilding their communities in south-central Los Angeles. It became a viral hit, not because it glamorized violence, but because it showed something rare in the true crime genre: hope. For decades, fear had been the best-selling product. Now, truth was taking its place. The final reckoning. The rise and fall of America's most dangerous gangs tell a story of humanity at its extremes: the hunger for power, the cost of loyalty, and the search for identity in a world that often denies both. But as the cycle breaks, one truth remains: redemption doesn't erase the past, it rewrites the ending. The same neighborhoods that once echoed with gunfire now echo with music, art, and the laughter of kids who might finally live long enough to dream. For every name etched into a headstone, there's another learning to build instead of destroy. And that, more than any indictment or reform bill, is how history changes. Because in the end, it was never just about gangs. It was about people, lost, found, and trying to belong. And as long as there's belonging without blood, the story might finally find peace. Epilogue: Lessons from the Fall. Sociologists now describe America's gang era as both a tragedy and a testament. A tragedy, for the generations consumed by violence. A testament, for the resilience of those who rose from it. Today, many of the most effective youth advocates are men and women who once ran those same streets. Their message isn't polished or political, it's raw, personal, and real. The same fire that destroyed us, one reformed leader said, is the fire we're using to light the way for others. It's proof that even in the darkest chapters of history, the final word can still be written in light. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All information is drawn from verified public sources, including FBI and DOJ reports, Urban Institute research, UN development data, and reputable news outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Marshall Project.